Senate Bill 5375, the Secretary will read.
An act relating to the duty of clergy to report child abuse and neglect and amending RCW 26.44.020. Timing.
Amendment at the desk, amendment number 0071, the Secretary will read.
On page 7, line 11, after service, strike
Last line.
substantial bodily harm.
Senator Christian.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move 0071 be adopted.
Senator Christian moves adoption of amendment number 0071. Remarks, Senator Christian.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've been married to the same lady for 40 years, and I'm glad that the state and many others have an exemption in there that allows her not to have to testify against me or disclose things she may know about me. I grew up together. We got married at 18. She knows everything about me. Mr. President, there's also exceptions in the law that allow for attorneys to have that same exemption. It is the bedrock of the attorney-client privilege. The fact that somebody can trust the person they're talking to be able to have an open, honest conversation so that the attorney can build a good defense. And of course, in there's some exemptions in that if there's risk of death or serious bodily harm, say. All this amendment does is put this bill in line with the same language and statements that an attorney has. That a person going to attorney, person going to the clergy would have the same rules and the same expectations. It is the bedrock of these jobs, Mr. President. And I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. Standing to urge a no vote on this amendment. Speaking directly to what the good member from the 4th just spoke to, it is the same because we are not modifying privilege as it relates to prosecution. That is not the point of this law. This law is about mandated reporting of child abuse and neglect, including sexual abuse of children. Unfortunately, this amendment would add a loophole that would allow ongoing cover-up of child abuse and neglect. Mr. President, I do not think we should wait to meet the test of imminent death or substantial bodily harm to protect a child from abuse or neglect, including sexual abuse. This is just about mandated reporting laws. It's just about protecting children. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is the motion to adopt amendment number 0071. As many are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, amendment number 0072. The Secretary will read.
On page 7, line 11, after service, strike
Last line.
death of the penitent or other person.
Senator Warnick.
Mr. President, I move amendment 0072 for adoption.
Senator Warnick moves adoption of amendment number 0072. Amendment to the amendment, amendment number 0077. The Secretary will read.
On page 1, line 6, after risk of, strike
Last
serious.
line. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move adoption of Amendment 77.
Senator Braun moves adoption of amendment number 0077 to amendment number 0072. Remarks, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a little bit complicated. It's an amendment to a bill that we have discussed here on the floor of the Senate in each of the last 3 years. It's a bill that is very important to many of us. It's a bill that we've been able to come largely to agreement in the last couple years where previous bills passed off unanimously or nearly unanimously. And I worry, Mr. President, that we're on the cusp of not reaching that same standard this year on this bill. So what this amendment does is simply modify some of the terms in the amendment from Senator Warnick to address the concern that the standard is too high for mandatory reporting for instances of neglect or potential assault or sexual assault. It's an attempt to get us closer to agreement on a bill that many of us think is very important, and I would encourage your support.
Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising to urge a yes on Amendment 77. I appreciate the effort of the good senator from the 20th to perfect this amendment. Thank you.
There are no further remarks. Question before the Senate is the motion to adopt amendment number 0077 to amendment number 0072. As many are in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment to the amendment is adopted. Question before the Senate is amendment number 0072 as amended. Remarks, Senator Warnick.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate the acceptance of the amendment to my amendment. I want to point out that this amendment copies conditions that are currently in law for sexual assault advocates. So it's already in statute about client confidential communications, and this would include those conditions with the clergy in certain cases. So I urge your support for this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. Respectfully rising to urge a no vote on this amendment. I spoke in the previous amendment about there being a loophole that would allow the cover-up of abuse and neglect of children, including the sexual abuse of children. This amendment goes further and makes that loophole even broader, Mr. President. And the language that is listed here is permissive, which is just a stating of current law. Members of the clergy may report abuse so they choose. That's current law. And I worry, Mr. President, that inclusion of this permissive language in the statute may create confusion for mandated reporters and may result in children continuing to be abused and neglected. So for that reason, Mr. President, I am urging a no vote.
Further remarks, Senator Short.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in support of the gentlelady's amendment, I think she thoughtfully picked a part of the law that deals absolutely directly with sexual assault victims and the needed reporting requirements. Specifically, I think it tailors it much better than some of the previous amendments. This is a huge issue. And I think at the end of the day, you know, we're hoping to be able to get there. And I think in large part, accepting this amendment would get so many of us there. We want to ensure that our children are not harmed and that actions are taken. And I just think that this amendment gets us there. And I would also ask for a roll call. Thank you.
Senator Short ask for a roll call. Do 1/6 of the members join in this demand? The demand is sustained. Further remarks? Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I'm not really excited about this particular bill because I believe it is a total infringement on a First Amendment issue. This amendment kind of threads that fine line because I believe this address, I mean, we've been talking about this for 3 years, going around and around in a circle. This particular amendment does really get to the heart of the matter and lays it out and says, in this condition, you have to report, you may report. If they thought that this was a serious issue, there was impending harm to a child. What person is not going to do that if they thought that there was an impending harm to a child? The fear is that if this amendment is not adopted and the bill goes through as drafted, that people would be less inclined to seek, the advice of clergy or a religious leader or elder in these matters. So this is a reasonable amendment. It helps thread that needle, and I urge your support.
Further remarks, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. President. Also rising in support of this amendment. This is, I think, a very important amendment. As I mentioned in my earlier comments, it's an issue we've struggled with on the floor of the Senate for 3 years now. It's one where we've found shared priorities. We found shared values. I have a great respect for the author of the bill and her commitment to preventing sexual assault in children. I think it's a commitment many of us, perhaps all of us, share on the floor of the Senate. But I think you have to recognize, Mr. President, as with much in public policy, it's often there are often conflicting values. Many on this floor, again, maybe all, have deep values to their, commitment to their faith. You can't fix one problem and ignore a whole host of other values. It just doesn't work that way, Mr. President. And the idea that in an effort to solve a very complicated public policy issue, that this is somehow suggesting a cover-up, I find deeply, deeply disrespectful. This is a genuine attempt to try to solve a problem our society faces in a way that recognizes the value of people's faith. That's what we have here today, Mr. President. This amendment would allow us to move forward together to address assault of children in our state. And I would ask you to deeply consider adopting this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is adoption of amendment number 0072. The request for a roll call was sustained. The Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado. Bateman. Banky. Braun. Chapman. Christian. Cleveland. Conway. Cortez. Cortez. Dingra. Dozier. Fortunato. Frame. Gildon. Gaynor. Hanson. Harris. Hasagawa. Holy. Kaufman. King. Krishna Dawson. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. McEwen Drew. McEwen Jim. Mazzal. Nobles. Orwell. Peterson. Ramos. Riccelli. Robinson. Saldana. Solomon. Schessler. Shoemake. Short. Slatter. Stanford. Torres. Trudeau. Valdez. Wagoner. Warnick. Wellman. Wilson Clare. Wilson Jeff.
Senator Cortez, how do you vote? Senator Cortez votes aye. Senator King? Senator King votes aye.
Mr. President, there are 21 yea, 27 nay, 1 excused.
Having failed to receive a majority vote, the amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, amendment number 0074, the Secretary will read.
On page 16, after line 2, insert the following.
Last line.
Section 3, 26.44.030, and insert 26.44.030, 28A.310.280, and 28A.300.040.
Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move amendment number 74. Adoption of amendment number 74.
Senator Fortunato moves that amendment number 0074 be adopted. Remarks, Senator Fortunato.
You know, Mr. President, we've been talking about this centering around clergy reporting for a couple of years, but we haven't really been addressing another area of extreme concern. Recently in the Tacoma News Tribune, they pointed out that Pierce County school districts paid over $51 million in sexual harassment claims in the school districts. People will point out that teachers and school employees are already mandatory reporters, which is true, they are. So that's not the concern. The concern becomes is what happens if there is an incident. How is that addressed? How does the school district address this issue? The concern is that school employees are simply terminated. Maybe a deal is made with a non-disclosure agreement. The employees may be terminated or maybe just simply resigns, and then moves on to somewhere else. And there's no, when they go to get a background check, there's nothing shows up because there's no, claim on that of impropriety that they can check. What this amendment does is it simply says, if this happens within a school district, that gets reported to the superintendent of public instruction, and we, as a legislature, also get notified. We get a list. We know what those claims are. We know how it's being handled, and we know what the disposition of it is. If we are truly concerned about our children, we need to be addressing the wider scope and address it in its entirety and protect our children in any aspect as they're growing up. They deserve to have a safe life, a safe childhood, Mr. President, where they can be kids without the threat of being sexually assaulted. So I urge your support of this amendment.
Further remarks, Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. Respectfully rising to urge a no vote on this amendment. We have dealt extensively with the issue of sexual abuse and misconduct in the educational setting. It is already required in the statute that our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI, report all types of disciplinary action to the national database, and that information can be provided to the legislature at any time that we request it. And we go further that the collecting of this information, sexual misconduct must be brought up in the hiring process, again, already in current statute. So, Mr. President, I do not believe another law is needed here, and if it is, that is the subject of another bill that should be introduced at another time. It is not related to this topic. So I'm asking, Mr. President, that we vote no and focus on the mandated reporter law that we're talking about today. Thank you.
Senator Wagner.
Rising in support of the amendment, if, as Senator Frame says, this is already current statute, it certainly does no harm to include it here and would give some of us comfort on this side of the aisle. So urge adoption of the amendment.
There are Senator Fortunato.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. President. I will say, if this is the case, where is the report that we can then look at and all that stuff? So yes, there is a certain level of reporting. What this amendment does is also address the disposition of what actually happened, who was involved, and that superintendent of public instruction would then have a list of people that when a school district goes to hire somebody, they can also check that list. So for that matter, I urge your support. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator McCune.
I stand in support of this amendment, Mr. President. If you get online and review some of the statistics that are going on in schools across America, it's very shameful. And these are just the ones that got arrested. In 2022, there was 350 teachers and coaches in schools that got arrested as well. I don't know if their names were swept under the rug or they just moved on. Some of these are silver suits, but that Pierce County was a silver suit. So I'm not sure those names show up on the list since it was a civil suit or a criminal suit. Obviously, if it's criminal, it will show up. You can find out that evidence. So I stand strongly in support of this amendment. Thank you.
If there are no further remarks to the question before the Senate, is the motion to adopt amendment number 0074. As many are in favor, will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted. Further amendments, amendment number 0075, the Secretary will read.
Strike everything after the enacting clause and insert the following new section.
Last line.
Creating a new section.
Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to withdraw this amendment. We've already covered some of the things already included. Thank you.
There's no objection. Amendment number 0075 is withdrawn. Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules be suspended, that Senate Bill 5375 be advanced to third reading, the second reading considered the third, and the bill be placed on final passage.
Senator Frame moves that the rules be suspended and Senate Bill 5375 be advanced third reading, second reading considered the third, and the bill be placed on final passage. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Senate Bill 5375 on third reading and final passage. Remarks, Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to say, Mr. President, it's a privilege today to bring to this chamber the voices of victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse who are calling on this body and this legislature to finally take action to protect today's children. I want to acknowledge that some of those survivors are in the chamber today and are watching at home on TV. I want to acknowledge that this is an emotional topic for many, myself included, and the conversation that we've had today is likely deeply triggering to those like me that have experienced the trauma of being abused as a child. I know that many of my colleagues are reflecting very deeply on the choice before them, and so as we continue this conversation today, I want to reiterate and make abundantly clear what this legislation is and what it is not. This legislation is about protecting children and interrupting child abuse and neglect, including the sexual abuse of children. It does so by requiring members of the clergy to be mandated reporters, similar to how teachers, doctors, nurses, psychologists, and child care providers already are because of the close relationship that they have with our children. As I stated earlier, Mr. President, the proposal is limited to our mandated reporter laws, which focuses on protecting children. This legislation does not modify privileges that exist in the context of prosecution of perpetrators. That is a different conversation for a different day. I will say, Mr. President, I do believe that this legislation is about separation of church and state, but perhaps not in the way that has been discussed to date. This legislation follows previous rulings on mandated reporter laws in this state, which upheld the, quote, state's interest in the protection of children as unquestionably of the utmost importance. We believe that this bill meets that same legal test, starting with the fact that we have a secular legislative purpose. Our secular legislative purpose is to protect children from abuse and neglect. That is our job. And we cast our votes today as representatives of the people who elected us to serve in the public interest. Bottom line, the state does not have to be complicit when religious communities who engage in the practice of covering up abuse and neglect choose to do so. One of the survivors who testified before the Senate Human Services Committee shared that if religious doctrine puts members of the clergy at odds with state law and puts them in what they feel is an impossible position, it is on that religious community to change their rules, not insist that we change our state laws. As you will remember, Mr. President, the legislation before you follows reporting by Investigate West that revealed years of cover-up of sexual abuse and neglect of children in a particular faith community here in Washington State, in that case, the Jehovah's Witness community. And they pointed directly to the fact that we did not have a mandated reporter law as the reason that they were able to cover that up. Because in that faith community, It says, but for law that mandates you to report that abuse, you are instead to send that report up to the central office where they will determine if it is the right interest to protect that child. I maintain, Mr. President, it is our public interest and it is our job to check on that child and make sure that they are safe when we find out about abuse and neglect. So, Mr. President, the bill before you today has no exemption when it comes to mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect, again, including sexual abuse, and it compels members of the clergy to report to authorities when they learn about child abuse and neglect, no matter the scenario in which they obtain that information, Mr. President. As you've heard me say before, this is about checking on the child. This is about making sure we, the state, have the information we need to go make sure that kid is okay. And what our mandatory reporter laws do is it compels our Department of Children, Youth, and Families or law enforcement to further investigate and substantiate that report, but in the meantime, ensure that that child is safe. Children need trusted adults. They need to know that if they tell somebody they're being abused, like I told my teacher in the 5th grade that I was being abused, that they can trust that that person will make it stop. That is what Mrs. McAuliffe at Maple Grove Middle School in Battleground, Washington did for me as a 10-year-old girl. And I hope all of you will ask members of our faith communities to do the same so that those children can trust them. We are one of only 5 states left that does not require clergy to report. It's time. I ask for you to vote yes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Christian.
Thank you, Mr. President. And my heart felt sympathies go out to the prime member of this bill and her story. It's very real. I know it's hurtful. And it's directed her life and probably the reason why she's here today with so much passion. But Mr. President, on September 1984, I put on my best uniform, I shined my shoes, and I walked into hangar number 2 at McChord Air Force Base, where I saw a C-141B, a Lockheed Martin C-141B, a big, huge cargo airplane, all lit up with the maintenance stands and lights, and I was in awe of this. Mr. President, I was so honored that the people of this country would allow a person with such a troubled past, a teenager, to work on that plane, and I was in awe. Now, Mr. President, as the years went on and you work in the rain in Tacoma, and the effects of working on airplanes takes a toll on your body, I lost much of that awe of that airplane and of the job. But here I am, Mr. President, in this facility, my 4th legislative session, and I walk in each day with the awe and the honor to be doing this job. But today, that awe and honor is over with for today. Because, Mr. President, we're considering a bill that could put pastors in prison. It sets up the legal framework to put pastors in prison, but not for their actions per se, but rather because of knowledge they may have gained in their job. It's a very slippery slope. So I actually spent quite a bit of time the last couple of years praying over this bill, reading it, talking to pastors. And you know, it was pointed out to me really clearly, we have a mandatory reporting in schools. Teachers are mandatory reporters. But yet, our children still get hurt in schools. No matter what law we pass, the students are still getting hurt in the schools. Why is that? Did this law fix that? Then I go to the state. We have members of workers of this state who are mandatory reporters who work with children, youth, and families. Yet, children in this state are still being hurt today, Mr. President. And we are paying out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements because of the harm this state and some of its bad actors are causing. We pay the price as taxpayers for that. So I actually sat down with a lady who had much the same experience as the prime sponsor of this bill. And she poured out her heart. But this bill does not fix that issue. This bill would not have made her any safer because the person who caused the problem, who caused the, committed the crime, and it was a crime, wouldn't report on himself. And this bill can't force somebody to give up their Fifth Amendment rights to the Constitution. You can't have a bill that says you have to give up your rights and report on yourself. So then I started asking, what's this bill really about? And this bill is really about setting up the framework so that a pastor has to choose whether they are going to obey God's law or are they going to choose to obey man's law. That's what this bill is about. It is forcing somebody who's given their entire life, raised their hand, made an oath with God Almighty to choose between God's law and man's law. I also want people to do the right thing, but this bill could put pastors in prison. Please vote no.
Further remarks, Senator Warnock.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is one of the hardest bills, along with Senator Christian, the hardest bill for me to stand up and say no to. I've been a Catholic all my life. I don't usually share that in this body. I believe we should keep religion and government control separate. This is not doing that. This is going after a long-held belief in my religion. I signed on to a bill a few days ago that we heard on this floor, and it was advocating for, let me read it here, freedom to practice one's own faith.
Please proceed.
Yeah, thank you, I'm sorry. Freedom to practice one's own faith, free of fear and judgment. This bill doesn't do that. This bill takes away that freedom for some churches. I am very, very sorry for the victims. I know there's been victims in the past. I met some of them when they came to the hearing on the initial bill. I have met some at home in my own family. But I've also met victims of the clergy who were unfairly attacked. One priest I know, great man, he grew up next door to me, his family. He was accused, he was taken out of service for years, until it was found that he had never even met the person who accused him. So it goes both ways. I do feel for those children that have been molested or assaulted. I really, my heart goes out to them. My heart goes out to the children and their family. But this bill, as was said earlier, won't help. And I'd like to read from a letter I received just yesterday.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. This came from a man who is studying to be a clergyman in the Evangelical Methodist Church in Moses Lake. He sums this up very well. He says it much better than I ever could. The bill as a concept is not an issue. It is quite a noble and good thing to implement. However, I feel the damage to the societal fabric churches operate on for the betterment of all people. If people cannot confide their sins in church to seek forgiveness and change without fear of punishment, then those who need to be ministered to the most will not come and may continue doing harm. And that is my fear. If people who want to ask for forgiveness for their past sins, they will not come and ask for help. I truly feel that to my deepest core. So I am so sorry I'm not going to be able to support this bill today.
Further remarks, Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, this is something near and dear to my heart, but a couple of years ago, this body unanimously passed a bill off this floor that dealt with clergy reporting. So among us, that's not an issue whatsoever. It's currently they are reporters by policy. Senator Frame referenced changing the rules. Nobody has changed rules more than the Catholic Church on the things that they have done and the requiring for training. And you can't even be with another a young child unless you go through the training and there's multiple people, et cetera. So there's very, very stringent rules in place now because of some of the things that have happened in the past. But when those planes hit the World Trade Center, I remember I was at the end of my driveway, I was bringing my kid to the school bus, and I said, now is the test. Freedom versus security. How much freedom are we willing to give up for security because of that event? This is the same thing. This is religious freedom versus protection. We, as an organization, everyone in this room wants to do the maximum we can to protect our children. But I want you to think about how human nature addresses this. People, there's a human nature. There's just a natural progression of things. A person that would seek counsel from a clergy member, could be a tribal elder, could be a priest, could be a minister, that person feels guilty. It's why they are seeking this counsel. That is something that we as human beings experience. Guilt. It's why we do it. Passing this bill the way it is will remove that option, if you will. If I have done something that's horrendous, and I go to a clergy member and I start talking to him, even if I did that in confession, for example, the priest is going to say, we need to talk this, outside of confessional, we need to discuss this, you need to get into deeper. You are giving that person who is seeking redemption an opportunity to get the counseling that they need. Passing this bill will simply eliminate that. So now you're going to have people that maybe do feel this guilt, but they're not going to go and seek any kind of counsel, and they may continue to offend. So I believe this is the wrong remedy. We want to protect our children. We want to make sure that we also protect our First Amendment rights to freedom of religion. This little piece, this little sacrament in the Catholic Church called confession is extremely important to us. It is something that allows you as a human being to get those things off your chest, confess your sins. But people don't go into a confessional and say, I'm going to do something. You can't get absolution for something you haven't done. It takes that whole thing away. So this is the wrong remedy to solve the problem that we have. We had an opportunity to go back to something that was unanimously supported by this chamber, and we chose not to accept that. So obviously I can't support this amendment or this bill, and I urge the others not to do it as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
If there are no further, Senator Mazzal.
Sorry, Mr. President. April 4th will be the second anniversary of my niece's death. Molested as a child, she struggled her entire life to accept her plight and begin self-medicating as a teenager. We could never get her the help she needed. I struggle with this bill, not nearly as much had the amendment passed. As the president of my congregation, I dealt with another instance of an adult molesting a child. Now, though it had happened or had begun, the adult was not a member of our congregation, and there had not been any admission to clergy. But once we had an idea that that individual, who had served as a volunteer, was in any way involved, we no longer allowed that individual to be involved in a volunteer position, and the local police department ended up arresting him. He was sent to Monroe, where he then went off his treatment and died of the cancer that he was afflicted with. World's a pretty terrible place sometimes, Mr. President. And sometimes we deceive ourselves into believing that this body can create laws that are going to stop that evil. We can affect them, but we're never going to stop it. One of the more cherished things, and I'm not Catholic, but one of the most cherished things, I believe, is our relationship to our religious leader. It really doesn't make any difference what religion we're in. They are our connection. They are our connection to what we hope and believe and what we consider for an afterlife. I'm troubled with this legislation because though I think it was well-intentioned, I think that this deeply affects that relationship and the trust we have with our faith leaders. I think that we have passed legislation that addresses this. I think that we have certainly conceded many things that were pretty dear. I just feel that to a certain degree, this marginalizes the relationship that we have with our faith and the people who help us in it. So today, Mr. President, I won't be able to vote for this. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Solomon?
Thank you, Mr. President. This is certainly a bill and a policy that conflicts me in my heart. Of course, we want to do everything we can to protect children. My mother, may her memory be a blessing, used to tell me, growing up Jewish, how she really hated being subjected to prayers, Christian prayers, in her classroom. She just really struggled with that. And it wasn't until later that the enforcement of the separation of church and state stopped that policy. She didn't want the church in her government-funded school. Many in the church don't want the state to insert itself into their practices. And so to me, there's a fairness. I have a reluctance, therefore, to insert the state into their practices. But as a father, I need to make sure I feel my community's children and my child is safe. We passed a compromise in the past, and I would have preferred that we do that this year. And this is not an easy vote, but I will be supporting the bill. Thank you.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is final passage of Senate Bill 5375. The Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado. Bateman. Banky. Braun. Chapman. Christian. Cleveland. Conway. Cortez. Dingra. Dozier. Fortunato. Frame. Gildon. Gaynor. Hanson. Harris. Hasagawa. Holy. Kaufman. King. Krishna Dawson. Leas. Lovelet. Lovick. McHugh and Drew. McHugh and Jim. Mazzal. Nobles. Orwell. Peterson. Ramos. Riccelli. Robinson. Saldana. Solomon. Schessler. Shoemake. Short. Slatter. Stanford. Torres. Trudeau. Valdez. Wagner. Warnick. Wellman. Wilson Clare. Wilson Jeff. Mr. President, there are 28 yea, 20 nay, 1 excused.
Having received a constitutional majority, Senate Bill 5375 is declared pass. The title of the bill will be the title of the